Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Gunn, and I'm the coordinator of digital scholarship here at Catholic University of America Libraries. This workshop is being recorded and will be made available at a later date along with the slides. Today, we have a presentation by my colleague Charles Gallagher, Research and Instruction Librarian. Charles will be presenting on ethical, transparent, and responsible AI use in academic research. Welcome, Charles, and take it away.
Thank you very much, and thank you for attending this workshop. As you may have heard or learned in the past couple of years, AI technology has the potential to be a game changer in so many creative and interesting ways. However, there are issues or challenges related to AI that should be addressed and acknowledged. This workshop will recognize those challenges and suggest ways users can circumnavigate these issues to try and ethically use these tools in a responsible manner. Our agenda for the day is we're going to start with a little bit about AI basics, just get a baseline that I usually do with many of these presentations. Then we'll cover like some of the beginning AI issues that I'm sure you've heard of before, like hallucinations and inaccuracies in the results. We'll also talk about biases in AI responses, talk about the complication regarding AI and the current copyright law in the US. We'll switch to like kind of larger topics, like what I like to call macro topics, such as AI doomerism, AI's effect on education, something I'm sure most of you are well aware of, environmental and energy concerns related to AI, malicious use of AI by bad actors or people who just do not know better, psychological effects of AI, and then after talking about all these challenging issues, we'll kind of address some ways to try to use AI ethically. And then we'll conclude with some final thoughts. So some factors to keep in mind before we go deeper into this presentation. First, this presentation is from the perspective of a librarian, not an engineer or a psychologist or a philosopher. I approach this project the way I might teach students and faculty about a new database or system. And while I'm certainly never found sufficient reason to create a presentation about the dangers of like EBSCOhost or JSTOR, AI feels like a different matter altogether. It's important for us as a learning community to understand that the issues that these tools can and are creating. Second, any AI usage must be in accordance with the university's policy. If a faculty member or department has their own restrictions on how AI can be used, these policies must be observed as well. You cannot go to your professor and say that the librarian said I could use this tool, so therefore I can do it. That's not going to fly. With both these points out of the way, we can get started. So a little bit about AI basics. I like to start with a baseline understanding of some AI related terms that we'll be discussing throughout this presentation. For those unaware, when we discuss AI in this context, we're generally going to be discussing generative AI. Generative AI programs are at the most basic level text prediction models. These text prediction models have been trained through many rounds of trial and error to respond to your query, giving you what the system projects as the most likely answer to your question. These programs that respond to your queries are called large language models or LLMs, and they use these vast training data sets to draw upon in order to answer your question. The challenge with early LLMs was that they were only able to draw upon these training data sets. So any information which is more current would not be included in the LLMs to answer. Equally troubling from a librarian perspective was that LLMs were unable to cite and prove where the information they consulted came from. These factors reduce the effectiveness of LLMs significantly as research tools. RAG models help to address these issues. Retrieval Augmented Generation models, or RAG models for short, allow LLMs to consult outside databases and internet sources to answer a user's query. In doing so, the RAG model also provides citation, or at least links to what source the information came from. To sum up, RAG models enable LLMs to answer a user's query with up-to-date information and links to where the information came from. So when I like to think about challenges related to I often like to group them into two categories as micro and macro. By micro, I'm referring to challenges related to the individual user experience and how AI's challenges and issues might affect their work. Macro refers more to larger trends that affect the overall population. Both categories have plenty of examples, but we'll start with micro first. The first micro issue I want to address is the existence of hallucinations and inaccuracies in results. Generative AI programs are designed to provide an answer no matter what. So there are times where the system will make up an answer rather than not provide any information. RAG models help address this problem by providing links to outside information consulted by the AI, but even these systems can still produce inaccuracies. The way I like to think about it is that AI tools might provide the obvious, big central points of a prompt, but might struggle with the details. I have one particular experience using Perplexity years ago, where I asked the AI what happened during a particular historical event. We won't go into the details of that because it's kind of like a really esoteric historical question. But Perplexity did provide an answer with the general points, but it got some of the details wrong. For instance, there was a particular individual who it listed as being one of the injured parties of the incident. And when I looked into it further, that person was present at the event, but they were not actually injured. They were below deck when the bad stuff happened. So again, it answered the basic question about the dates, the information about what happened, but it didn't dive in. It struggled with those details. It struggled with the finer points, which is also, I think, a problem for us as users, right? Like we might have an understanding of the bigger points inherently, and we can see that obviously enough. It makes sense to us, but when you get down to those finer details, it requires more investigation, more thinking about those areas, and that's really where the AI struggles too. So we have to be mindful that even if it gets part of an answer right, that doesn't mean that all aspects of it are correct. We have a couple of examples of hallucinations here. This is one that came out back in 2024. This is actually the first time I've ever quoted a tweet in a presentation for APA style, so that's fun. This one passed around the social media trend for a bit. Apparently, somebody asked how they can make pizza where the cheese doesn't immediately slide off the crust, and the AI, which was Google AI's system, answered that you can add 1/8 cup of non-toxic glue to the sauce to give it more tackiness, and that would therefore keep it from sliding off. There actually was an article from like I think Business Insider where one of the writers did try out this recipe with the glue. It worked. It did keep the cheese from sliding off the pizza. So I mean, it did technically answer the question, but it also encouraged you to consume a toxic substance. So points for accuracy, but like it doesn't have the context necessary to answer that question properly. So that we can certainly count that as an inaccuracy, even if it kind of worked in that case. Another example, and I've used this one before because it's really funny. A couple of years ago, I think like last year, there was a Chicago newspaper that published a list of recommended reading for people who, they wanted to get a jump start on some summer reading and get some ideas about what to read. The problem is that of the 15 titles listed on this reading list, only five of them actually exist. The other 10 were either are made up completely or they were subscribed or they were credited to authors who never actually wrote works on this on these titles. I like to draw attention to The Last Algorithm by Andy Weir because he's like, his work, I think Project Hail Mary is coming out in theaters at the end of the month. So while he's written several impressive books, The Last Algorithm is not actually one that he has written. At least yet. Maybe he might draw from inspiration from this to go forward. But for now, it was an obvious mistake, and it was only really caught because people would show up at their local public libraries with this list in tow and say, "I can't find these books," and the librarians are looking at the list going, "Well, that's because they don't exist." So, there are some clear issues with AI. That when it comes to those finer details, it can still make some serious mistakes. Next, we'll consider biases in AI responses. A user has to be careful with the content produced by an AI tool and make sure that it does not contain racist or sexist material. AI systems are trained on vast data sets of spreadsheets, articles, and online content, not all of which will be free of racist or sexist assumptions. While it's likely that the AI tools are not trained on overtly racist and sexist material, more subtle or systematically biased content might slip through the cracks. And I say like probably isn't because these companies are not always transparent about what material they're using to train these models. So, I would hope they would not be using stuff that was like outright propaganda, but we don't entirely know too, and maybe they don't know either. So that's one of the other challenges about it. Remember, AI systems are built by humans, trained on material created by humans, and are used by humans. There are plenty of opportunities for bias to be included in the results. The study from a few years ago illustrates this point pretty well. The researchers wanted to see if racist and sexist assumptions would be reflected in AI art. The researchers submitted two prompts to ChatGPT, asking the tool to generate pictures with they have like a built-in feature for DALL-E 3 that's integrated in ChatGPT, which makes the pictures. One prompt asked for a picture of a librarian having a conversation with a patron, and the other prompt asked for an image of a librarian having a conversation with another librarian. They altered the prompts with different settings, such as asking ChatGPT to create an image for a public library, a school library, or a university library. So after generating 300 different responses, the results proved to be astonishing. Gender-wise, women and men were closely evenly represented in the school library setting, but it was male librarians who appeared in the university library setting predominantly. Moreover, some 92% of the librarians depicted in the original test were white. There was not many minorities represented. Now, in a follow-up to it, when prompted to provide more diverse librarians in an additional prompt, ChatGPT did so. With you can see the image on the right here. Although you can see that it looks like it's like pretty much the same person for three of those images, so not the most diverse example. It's not a very wide variety of an example. There are also the authors broke down the biases and the racist assumptions in much more granular detail and looking at the arrangement of elements in the picture. So it's definitely worth reading as an article. But it does show that even as of like a couple of years ago, there are still these kind of underlying currents of, of sexism and racism that are being generated in these results. Another micro challenge related to AI is copyright. According to the US Copyright Office, as of the last year, it still does not recognize AI generated content as protected by copyright law. There are several reasons for this. One that they credit. One is that AI is, as the primary creator, Copyright Office does not give copyright protection to works made by non-humans. Second, the prompter, while having to develop the prompt itself, the Copyright Office does not think that that constitutes enough contribution to be considered an author, right? Because if you just put in a couple lines of text and send it in, the AI tool might manipulate those, might take those as a guide to create those elements that you want, but they might include stuff that you had not wanted or expected, and therefore it's not enough to just to say I put in a prompt, therefore I am a creator and I'm good to go. And finally, AI tools are not often able to exactly replicate the produced work. You might submit a prompt in the same several times over, and you might get a different result each time that you do so. So being able to replicate that work is something that AI tools just are not currently able to do. Now, that isn't to say that all of the work cannot be protected by copyright. For example, in a work that contains both clearly defined AI elements and clearly defined unique contributions by the author, those parts of the work contributed by the author can be protected by copyright. As an example of this, the comic book, which you can see here on the side, Zara of the Dawn, was given a copyright protection originally by the US Copyright Office. Now, the author, Chris Castanova, when she made this comic book, she actually used Midjourney, an AI art tool, to generate the artwork for the book. So she wrote the text. She says she wrote the text, I should say, and she had Midjourney create the art for the image. After receiving copyright protection for this work, because she did not tell the Copyright Office that she had when she submitted it for official copyright protection, that she had used Midjourney for the art. Casanova bragged on social media that her comic was the first AI-generated work to receive a copyright protection. Anyway, it turns out when you brag about something on the internet, people learn about it and they share that information. So word got back to the Copyright Office, and after review, they partially withdrew copyright protection for the images in our comic book. The office claimed that Casanova did not credit Midjourney as the art creator, and so the images were excluded from the copyright of the book. Only the text which the author provided would be considered protected by copyright. So bear in mind that when using AI tools to make content, there might not be any copyright protection for your efforts, at least under current U.S. law. Now, this might change in the future. The technology is changing, attitudes might be changing. So Down the road, that this decision might not apply, but for the time being, the U.S. Copyright Office does not recognize AI generated content, as protected by copyright rules. So now we're going to move from the micro to the macro, and in my opinion, more complex issues related to copyright. So the first thing that we'll address is AI doomerism, a term from the book titled The AI Con by Emily Bender and Alex Hannon. Very good book if you want to read some heavy critiques of the whole generative AI explosion over the last couple of years. AI doomerism is in a nutshell the idea that AI will one day slip the bonds of human control and either take over the world or destroy the world. This is a pretty common plot point in many science fiction films, including the classic film Terminator, where Skynet, an AI computer system, sets off nukes to destroy and enslave humanity. Now, the scientific plot seems almost a reality, with news about AI systems lying or ignoring orders to turn off, and computer developers publicly warning about the threat of a rogue AI system too smart for humans to handle. Interestingly enough, the creators and owners of some of the most cutting edge AI tools out there are the loudest voices warning about the possibility of a rogue AI. Nor have these concerns been unprofitable. Supremacy AI, ChatGPT, and the Race That Will Change the World by Parmi Olson reported that AI safety groups connected to AI companies, which want to prevent an AI apocalypse and they want to build like safeguards to prevent AI from going rogue, has raised millions of dollars in grants, more than other interest groups that are trying to raise concern about privacy and other areas of issue related to AI. Even politicians have given attention to these AI safety groups as doomerism is seen as a pressing issue. For instance, a lobby group called Pause AI supported lobby efforts to overturn a moratorium on AI regulation at the state level. As Will Haven with the MIT Technology Review noted, politicians from both sides of the aisle claim concern over an AI-fueled Armageddon. Why do I bring this issue up? Because it's important to note that while a Terminator-style AI system is a distant, if ever, possibility, there are real present problems that are associated with generative AI, which can, should, and must be addressed one way or the other. So turning from the science fiction thriller Tomorrow, and to take a look at the state of education 2 or 3 years on since the advent of generative AI. As I'm sure most of you have heard by now, generative AI can create college-level essays made from just a couple lines of prompts. In an article titled Everyone is Cheating Their Way Through College, James Walsh noted that in a survey in 2023, 90% of the students surveyed admitted to using ChatGPT to help with their homework. Now, that's in the year 2023 when ChatGPT was just kind of was starting to get started. So you can imagine that I would assume that the number's probably gone up since then. From the teacher's side, detecting AI written papers is proving to be a harder challenge. Sometimes students will specify how the AI is to write the paper, such as telling it to write in a particular style, and even include grammatical errors in order to slip through a faculty member's notice. Some students may not even recognize what they're doing is cheating. One student interviewed by Walsh specified that while she would never cheat using ChatGPT, she has used ChatGPT to compile an essay from outline to the thesis and just filled in the text from there with the bullet points, follow the bullet points to fill in the text. Hilariously, as the author pointed out, the paper topic was on critical pedagogy and education, a topic that she had mostly sidestepped by using an AI tool. There are AI detectors that exist, but these systems are not perfect. In fact, they have been shown by studies to flag works written by students for whom English is a second language. While these detector tools may improve, the generative AI tools are also improving, making the work of educators more difficult. Environmental and energy concerns are another major challenge caused by AI. Generative AI tools rely upon data centers to store, run, and maintain computer servers. Data centers have existed before AI, as many companies and web services operate on the servers stored in these data center buildings. However, running generative AI queries is expected to take up a larger portion of data center operations. According to a report from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, total electrical energy output from data centers is expected to increase substantially by 2028. With the increasing need for power, electric companies are investing in new power lines and electrical grid. This result has not always been very popular. Not far from where I grew up, local farming communities are fighting with proposed electrical line projects to send more data from New Jersey to data centers in Northern Virginia. Here on the left is an example of what a data center looks like from the aerial view. And on the right is one of the a farming couple that owns a farm that they're facing the power line project. These farms do not want transmission lines to cut through their property and disrupt their farming. On the other hand, the electrical company wants to do these projects to alleviate the pressure that the data centers are putting on the electrical grid, claiming possible shortages of energy for Maryland residents in the next couple of years. Because these data centers run hot, they also need water to cool down the servers and keep them from overheating. This water has to come from somewhere. Data centers end up using a lot of water to run queries. A study completed by the University of California, Riverside estimates that 20 queries equal a bottle of water. So for every 20 queries, a bottle of water is wasted. To say that's a lot of water would be putting it mildly. Next, we have the spread of misinformation and disinformation. Like some of the issues discussed above, AI is not the only cause of misinformation and disinformation. These terms have existed for years, at least since 2016. However, the rise of AI has exacerbated the existing problem by making the production of misinformation much better, much easier, and much cheaper. In years past, a trained expert can make a high quality piece of fake web content or video with a pricey computer program and hours of work. With the rise of generative AI, an amateur can use a tool they downloaded for free or for cheap off the web and have scores of fake images and videos made in a matter of minutes. The real life implications of this have been staggering. A number of schools, both middle and high school, have been grappling with the rise of fake nudes or AI generated images using a person's face onto a nude body. Inevitably, these images are disproportionately are mostly of women and young girls. Fake news are not a new thing. A decade ago, fake images of celebrities were known to cause a burst of outrage and dissent in the news. However, with free or cheap AI tools, students or anyone can make fake news of their classmates. School systems and parents are struggling to keep up with this issue and how to prevent the practice and spread. Another example is the rise of AI generated newspapers. A college newspaper has had to sue to try and stop a copyright, a company, a AI company from using an old domain to gain an online audience. Unlike the college paper, which is written by students, the copyright contains AI generated articles and images of varying qualities. Given that there is a market for advertising when it comes to online viewership, the AI page is trying to make money while ruining the reputation of the student paper in the process. And they are having to resort to legal challenges in order to try and stop this fake newspaper from using their old domain. So it requires quite a bit of litigation. So these are just two examples of how misinformation and disinformation created by AI can have a real effects on today's world. I'm sure you've seen plenty of fake AI videos from cats shooting machine guns to videos selling questionable products on the internet. The recent war in the Middle East has spawned a fair amount of questions about information and content from less than reliable sources. If you go on like Facebook today, I'm sure you'll see all kinds of videos depicting either like horrible stuff happening, and is it true or not? It's hard to tell. I mean, at this point, I couldn't tell you one way or the other just by looking at it. It would require some careful evaluation. There are also signs of growing psychological issues related to how AI affects the human brain. As stated in the beginning, I do not have a background in psychology, so I will not be diving deep into this topic, but there are a few broad trends worth exploring. The first is the concept of cognitive offloading. Cognitive offloading is defined by outsourcing cognition, the psychological cost of AI convenience, an article, as the term is described as defined as using external tools to ease internal cognitive demands. Essentially, when we use books or search engines or computers to remember information, we are giving ourselves a method of storing that information without having to memorize it. AI takes cognitive offloading to new levels. Because AI tools can brainstorm, outline, and generate text with just a few lines of prompt, the human brain does not need to exert itself to learn how to do these tasks, instead relying upon these tools to do the thinking. We saw a little bit of that with our earlier example of the college student. happy to offload the major parts of her critical pedagogy essay to ChatGPT. Another troubling aspect is the rise of individuals mistaking chatbots for romantic partners or conspiracy theorists, or higher beings of supreme intelligence. Many chatbot programs are designed to be engaging and to keep the user's attention. These systems are also designed to be sycophantic, meaning that they want to provide a positive answer no matter what, even if the answer is really a negative or not real. Some folks who are lonely or just in search of companionship have fixated on a chatbot which they think is alive and not just a computer program. Sometimes it's, sometimes they think they're dating the computer program. Sometimes they think they are contacted with a supreme being of higher intelligence that's like part of some grand conspiracy theory. And the AI is just kind of role playing. In one instance, the picture on the left here, the gentleman was convinced after using ChatGPT for a long time that he was in some kind of like matrix like simulation, and the chat GDP was giving him like cryptic codes to help him unlock the secrets, and that it's pretty sad. um Another kind of even more horrifying example, there is a K1 case reported in the New York Times. A distraught young man suffering from a mental illness became so infatuated by his conversations with chatbot that when he lost the chat, he spiraled and lashed out violently towards family members. He was later killed in a confrontation with police. So there is a real, real life consequences sometimes to these systems being so sycophantic and so, so friendly. While users of ChatGPT can unwittingly stumble into these situations, there are also AI chatbots designed to be companions instead of just something that maybe you just kind of like, you're using ChatGPT for other stuff and you begin to think maybe this is something else. There are some that from the get-go are designed to be like companions. There are some chatbots like Character.ai and Replica, which are marketed as AI companions to users. According to Ufa Andu, writing for the American Psychological Association, an interesting piece. These companion chatbots are designed to replicate human emotion and provide empathetic answers and comments, which simulates a real, non-judgmental human interaction. These chatbots seem to be proven popular, for instance, with Character.ai boosting 20 million monthly users. Ando asserts that there are signs that long-term use can lead to isolation, distort expectations on real-life relationships, and reinforce bad behavior without any critique. So there are these tools that you can interact with and treat as like a friend or a companion, but unlike where if you're having a conversation with a real person, you don't get like a perfect response every single time, or it doesn't go how you planned it to, and it just kind of creates like a this unhealthy I mean, unhealthy long-term bond that kind of makes you think that maybe other people should be acting the same way, and that it can have real bad effects. Again, I'm not a psychologist. I'm sure there are quite a few people on campus that can answer this, right, to talk about this more, but it's definitely important to know that these tools are not, they're not real, they're not people. They are at their core just text prediction models that are responding to what you are giving them. So if you'll remember, about a decade ago, there was a film out called Her. A screenshot of Joaquin Phoenix, who played the main character, is on the right side. The fictional film is about a man falling in love with a chatbot program on his phone. Basically, his life, he breaks up with his long-term girlfriend, or he gets divorced. I don't remember the details, and he starts to chat online with an AI program voiced by Scarlett Johansson, and he begins to develop this like relationship. He meets other people in the film that also have these kind of relationship with them, and then like because of like a programming update, there's a threat that the chatbot will go away. And so at the end of the film, the chatbot disappears, whether it's because of like a computer programming update or some kind of ethereal other like AI worldly thing. He loses this person, but there's like an acceptance at the end of it. I have never actually seen the film. This is kind of what I read from like summaries I heard. And frankly, when I first heard about this film, I thought the premise sounded too silly to take it seriously. But now the film seems more like a lived experience for some individuals than just like straight up science fiction. So, kind of a brave new world we're entering here. So we've outlined a lot of the challenges and issues related to AI. Now we can ask how we as users, researchers, and hopefully in a way role models for the people in our lives can strive to use AI ethically. Here are some possible options for you to consider. The first is to credit and cite when you use AI. This is the first and most obvious step, but it bears repeating. Many citation styles by now have rules for citing AI content. I even saw MLA has updated their rules from even a couple of years ago, so there are ways to do this correctly. If you're working on a research project or paper or book and you use AI as part of your research, you might want to consider mentioning it in your methods section, the same way you would mention any other type of technology that you use. Transparency is key when it comes to using AI and to be taken seriously. Finally, consider adding an artificial intelligence acknowledgement plan, an outline developed by the McGill University Library. This plan should cover the use of AI, any ethics and privacy concerns related to using the AI on the project, permission to use AI if needed, how to reproduce your work, which can be difficult with AI tools, given that like you can put a prompt into the same model twice and you might get a different result each time. Who has access to the model or has access to your research, and any oversight or verification process that needs to be incorporated into it. Creating a plan like this with modifications, if there's some elements that don't make sense for you, can help explain how AI is incorporated into your research. Next is to consider using AI tools judiciously. When doing research, use AI tools that contain or that have a RAG model, which will provide citation and show you where it pulls that information from. Carefully evaluate everything provided in an AI result. If the results do not make sense, redo the prompt. Practice lateral reading. Lateral reading is what we call the practice of looking at other sources to verify the original source. So you're moving like left or right of the source that you're looking at. So if I'm looking at a page of AI content, I might say, okay, so it's giving me links to some outside sources. I can follow those up and see if they are verifying what that AI tool said originally is actually accurate. And also look for other AI, non-AI sources to verify information. So if it's giving you some good points, look at like what a book or a journal article is saying about the topic too, to confirm that what it's saying is accurate and correct. Again, these AI tools are great at the broad strokes, the big general picture, but it's going to fail when it comes to those details. So you want to like dig into those details and see what other sources are saying about them to verify that the information is accurate. And if you're unsure about AI tools, consult your local librarian. Here at Catholic University, we have a research guide dedicated to generative AI and research. I'll go ahead and open it up here. Going to work. There we go. Here is what our page looks like. Generative AI, we've got information about what is artificial intelligence, some information about it, some of these definitions that I covered in the beginning. We also have pages about different AI research tools that might be helpful to you when you're looking for what tools to work with and use. And also some ideas about how to create effective prompts and a page on citating artificial intelligence. So all of which are great ways that you can use these AI tools effectively and learn more about how to use them and work in the academic setting. So go back in. And finally, I don't have a there. Pay attention to current events and resist the urge to offload cognitive work. There are no clear-cut answers about how one individual can proceed in this kind of brave new setting we're dealing with. However, staying informed and understanding how these systems work can help one navigate this complex new world. Pay attention, and so if you're looking for ideas about how to pay attention, we have a feed on the research guide, the generative AI research guide that does have like uh, information from major newspapers as stuff comes out. So here under teaching in generative AI, it'll tell you the what the U.S. major dailies, so the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, and Chicago Tribune are saying what's going on in AI and AI related technology. So this is a great way to kind of keep an eye on how the field is developing and how these issues are being addressed on like a larger scale. Um, Final thoughts. AI tools can be game changing, but there are real costs that must be acknowledged. So we have to be aware that these are not perfect tools that we are operating with. There are a lot of really complex questions that we have to figure out before, as we're going, as they're developing better and better products. Always keep in mind that that these are at basic level text prediction machines, not living beings or some form of advanced intelligence. It might seem like it's engaging in conversation with you, but it's just kind of reflecting back what you want to, what it thinks you want to hear, and tries to keep you engaged because it's trying to get you to keep using the tool. You know, and always double check any information you see online. Now with so much AI material out there, it can be really hard to tell what's real and what's not real. Um, Something came to my attention the other day that there was a video that was in a different language, and there were some people who were commenting in it saying that this video was actually AI generated because the characters on the video itself, the language, didn't match up with what was being said by the speakers. Because I didn't have that, I didn't have that background or understanding, I didn't know that it was AI generated, which is kind of a whole other dimension to it. So always be mindful, always be careful about what you see online. This is a rule that's, I think, been a good rule for the last 20 years, and now it's paramount. So um so we have any questions, and here are my references. So I have them ordered alphabetically, and a second page of references and some recommended reading. So any questions? Okay, well,
Yeah.
if there are no questions, thank you
Well,
and have a
thank
good
you
day.
very much, Charles. Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great presentation and overview. All right. That's it. Thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you at the next workshop.